Nobody survives collapsing in front of Von Thorn, the man who built his empire on the principle that weakness gets you killed. But when a 6-year-old girl with tear-streaked cheeks looked up at him and said, "Sir, my mom's not waking up," something cracked open in the chest of a man who hadn't felt anything in 20 years. What happened in the next 3 minutes? The roared command, the stolen helicopter. The life-or-death race against time would either save a desperate single mother and her daughter, or expose the one vulnerability that his enemies had been waiting decades to exploit. But it started just 8 minutes earlier, when everything still seemed like a routine night. The industrial floor buffer hummed with a low, vibrating drone that traveled all the way up Delaney Shaw's arms, settling into her shoulders as a dull, persistent ache. It was the only sound in the cavernous lobby of Thorn Tower, a sprawling expanse of black marble and chrome that felt more like a fortress than a place of business at 2:00 inches the morning. Delaney tightened her grip on the handle, her knuckles white against the gray rubber. She wasn't just tired. Tired was a luxury she had lost months ago. This was a biological failure. A cold, sticky sweat had plastered her navy blue uniform to her lower back, despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Her vision was beginning to fray at the edges, little spots of static dancing in the corners of her eyes like interference on an old television screen. She knew exactly what was happening. She had felt this specific, terrifying hollowness enough times since her diagnosis to recognize the slide. Her blood sugar was dropping fast. Just 20 more minutes, she told herself, the thought sluggish and heavy, like wading through molasses. Finish the South Quadrant. Get the check. Buy juice. Get Piper home. She stopped the machine for a second, leaning heavily against the handle, breathing through her mouth. The air smelled of lemon polish and ozone. She reached into the pocket of her apron, her fingers trembling uncontrollably, searching for something she knew wasn't there. The roll of glucose tablets was empty. The granola bar she usually kept for emergencies had been split in half 3 hours ago, half for her, half for the 6-year-old girl currently hiding behind the maintenance closet near the private elevator bank. Delaney glanced toward the alcove, where the janitorial supplies were stored. From this angle, no one could see the small nest she had made with a spare coat and a backpack stuffed with coloring books. "Piper," she whispered, though the distance was too great for the child to hear. The anxiety of having her daughter in the building was an acid burn in her chest, competing with the dizziness. It was strictly against protocol. If the supervisor, Mr. Chen, found out, Delaney wouldn't just be fired, she would be blacklisted from the agency entirely. But the babysitter had demanded payment up front this week, and the envelope of cash Delaney had hidden in the coffee tin at their tiny apartment was gone, used to pay for Piper's asthma medication before the pharmacy refused to fill prescriptions on credit anymore. She had no choice. She never had choices anymore. Delaney pushed the buffer forward again, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The hunger wasn't a rumble in her stomach, it was a cellular scream. Her brain was misfiring, thoughts disjointed and fractured. She thought of the analyst position she used to hold 3 years ago, before the layoffs, before the medical bills, before everything collapsed. The anger flared hot and sudden, burning through the fog, but it was quickly extinguished by exhaustion. Focus. Clean the floor. Don't pass out. Get home to Piper. If you've ever felt invisible, been told you take up too much space, or had someone make you feel like you're too much or not enough, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and comment where you're watching from. We're building a family of people who refuse to shrink anymore. The private elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed softly. The sound was sharp and crystalline in the silence, echoing off the marble walls. Delaney froze. The security guard at the front desk, a tired-looking man named Morris, who usually turned a blind eye to Piper's presence, straightened up so fast his chair squeaked. The elevator doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. But what he discovered next changed everything. At the center of the emerging group was Von Thorn. Delaney had never seen him this close. She had seen him from a distance, stepping out of black SUVs or walking swiftly through the lobby, surrounded by a wall of suited men, always moving with the kind of purpose that made people instinctively step aside. He was the owner of the building, the owner of the city block surrounding it, and if the whispers in the break room were true, the owner of half the criminal infrastructure in the Northeast. Delaney shrank back, trying to make herself as small as the floor buffer would allow. She kept her head down, staring at the reflection of the overhead recessed lighting on the black stone. She prayed he would just walk to the exit, disappear into the night like he always did. But he stopped. That moment, everything in the room changed. Von Thorn paused in the center of the lobby, his head tilting slightly, his gaze sweeping the space with the precision of a man who noticed everything. The men around him, she recognized one called Marcus. Another named Dane stopped instantly, their eyes scanning the perimeter like programmed sentries. "The floor is wet," Vaughn said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth but carrying an edge of gravel, like tires rolling over crushed stone. "Why is the cleaning crew still here at this hour?" Morris, the night guard, stammered. Mr. Thorne short-staffed tonight, sir. She's just finishing up." Delaney felt the weight of his gaze land on her. It wasn't the leering look she got from the day shift executives, nor the dismissive glance of the building managers. It was a physical pressure, like being pinned under a microscope. She forced herself to look up, knowing that avoiding his eyes might seem suspicious or weak. Vaughn Thorne had eyes the color of cold steel gray with flecks of silver, startlingly sharp under the harsh lobby lights. They were intelligent, predatory, and currently narrowed in assessment. He wasn't looking at her uniform or her figure. He was looking at her face, cataloging details she couldn't control. The pallor of her skin, the tremor in her hands, the way she was gripping the machine like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He took a step toward her. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. "You're shaking," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of fact, delivered with the clinical detachment of someone who dealt in life and death every day. "I'm fine, sir," Delaney managed to say. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin, reedy, barely above a whisper. The world tilted violently to the left. She gripped the handle of the buffer so hard her fingernails ached. "Just finishing up." "You are not fine," Vaughn stated, taking another step. He was close now, close enough that she could smell him. Not the cloying cologne of the men she usually encountered, but something clean and sharp. Rainwater, starched linen, and something darker, like sandalwood and cold steel. The static in Delaney's vision expanded, eating up the periphery. The black marble floor seemed to rise up like a wave. She realized with a detached horror that she couldn't feel her feet anymore. The glucose in her brain had depleted below the critical threshold. The adrenaline that had kept her standing in the presence of the most dangerous man in the city was evaporating like morning fog. "Piper," she thought with sudden, desperate clarity. "I have to tell him about Piper before I—" One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. She started, but her tongue felt too large for her mouth. The words wouldn't form. The room was spinning now, a carousel of black marble and chrome, and those cold steel eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't decode. The last thing she saw was Vaughn Thorne's brow furrowing, the impassive mask slipping just a fraction as he realized she wasn't intimidated. She was dying. Then the lights went out. Delaney didn't feel the impact. She simply ceased to support her own weight. Her hand slipped from the machine and she crumpled, her body folding like paper, knees buckling, head tilting forward as consciousness fled. Vaughn Thorne watched the woman fall. He moved before his brain had fully processed the command, his reflexes honed by years of living in a world where hesitation meant a bullet in the chest propelling him forward. But he was too far away to catch her before she hit the ground. She landed with a sickeningly soft thud on the polished stone, her body going completely limp, one arm thrown out at an unnatural angle. He realized he wasn't alone. Someone else had arrived. "Boss!" Marcus barked, stepping in front of Vaughn, his hand instinctively going to the weapon concealed under his jacket. He assumed a threat, a sniper, poison, something that had taken the woman down so suddenly and completely. "Stand down," Vaughn ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. He ignored his security detail and dropped to one knee beside the fallen woman, his expensive suit pants pressing against the wet floor. He reached out, placing 2 fingers against the pulse point of her neck. It was there, but it was racing thready, erratic, like a trapped bird beating itself against a cage. "Get the car," Vaughn started, but the command died in his throat, because at that exact moment, a small figure emerged from the shadows near the maintenance closet. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, with dark hair in 2 braids, and wearing a pink jacket over pajamas, came running across the marble floor, her sneakers squeaking with each frantic step. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror that no child should ever have to feel. She ran straight toward Vaughn Thorne. Morris, the security guard, moved to intercept her, but Vaughn held up one hand, freezing everyone in place. The little girl didn't slow down. She didn't care that she was running toward the most dangerous man in the city, didn't care about the armed men or the massive lobby or anything except the woman lying motionless on the floor. She skidded to a stop right in front of Vaughn, so close he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, could see her bottom lip trembling as she tried to be brave and failing completely. And then she looked up at him with eyes that were the exact same shade as her mother's deep brown, terrified, pleading, and spoke the words that would shatter Von Thorn's carefully controlled world into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "Sir, my mom's not waking up." Her voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into a sob that she tried to swallow. Her small hands clenched into fists around the stuffed rabbit. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Von Thorn froze. For the first time in 20 years, since he was 16 and watched his father die in a warehouse execution, Von Thorn felt something crack open in his chest. It wasn't fear. He had long ago trained himself not to feel fear. It wasn't shock. He had seen worse things than a woman collapsing in a lobby. It was the child. The desperate, terrified child looking at him like he was her only hope, like he had the power to fix the one thing in her world that had just broken. And in that crystallized moment, Von Thorn realized 3 things simultaneously. 1. This woman had been hiding her daughter in his building, which meant she was desperate beyond measure. 2. The child had come to him for help, which meant she had been watching him, had decided with whatever logic children used that he was someone who could save her mother. 3. If he didn't act immediately, the woman on the floor would die, and the child would remember for the rest of her life that she asked a powerful man for help, and he did nothing. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. Von Thorn had built his empire on cold calculation, on ruthless efficiency, on the principle that sentiment was a weakness that got you killed. But looking at Piper, he didn't know her name yet, but he would learn it in the next 60 seconds, looking at her tear-streaked face and her trembling hands and her desperate, desperate hope. Von Thorn made a decision that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with the fact that some things, some very few things, were more important than control. He stood in one fluid motion, his hand already moving to the comm unit in his ear. And then Von Thorn roared a command that echoed through the empty marble lobby, through the private elevator shaft, through the entire 60-story tower that bore his name. A command that would change 3 lives forever. "Get the copter now." His voice was thunder. It was absolute authority. It was the voice of a man who could move mountains, who could make governments tremble, who could bend reality itself to his will if necessary. Marcus's eyes went wide. "Boss, we don't have..." "I don't care if you have to steal one from the hospital," Vaughn snarled, his hand still on his comm unit, his other hand moving to check Delaney's pulse again. "Landing pad, 3 minutes, medical team on standby, move." The security team scattered like startled birds, phones already out, voices overlapping as they made calls, activated emergency protocols that had never been used before, pulled strings that would cost millions in favors owed. Vaughn turned back to the little girl, whose eyes had gone even wider at his roar, but she hadn't run. She was still standing there, still clutching her rabbit, still looking at him with that desperate trust that he absolutely did not deserve. "What's your name?" Vaughn asked, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, though it still carried that edge of absolute command. "P. Piper," the girl whispered. "Piper," Vaughn repeated, committing it to memory. "Your mother is going to be fine. Do you understand me? I'm going to fix this, but I need you to be very brave right now. Can you do that?" Piper nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but something in her expression shifted relief, hope, the beginning of trust. Vaughn had killed men for less than what this moment was doing to him. This choice would define the rest of his life. He looked down at Delaney Shaw. He didn't know her name yet either, but he would learn everything about her in the next hour, and made a second decision that was just as irrational and just as absolute as the first. He was going to save her life, and then he was going to make damn sure she never had to hide her daughter in a maintenance closet ever again. Because Von Thorn had just discovered that there were exactly 2 people in this world who could make him feel something other than cold, calculated control. And he was going to protect them with everything he had, even if it destroyed him. The helicopter's rotor wash turned the rooftop of Thorn Tower into a maelstrom of wind and noise, the kind of controlled chaos that only unlimited resources could summon at 3 in the morning. Von Thorn stood at the edge of the landing pad, his suit jacket whipping around him. Piper clutched against his chest with one arm, while he barked commands into his phone with the other. The child had her face buried in his shoulder, her small hands fisted in his shirt, and she hadn't let go since he'd lifted her mother's unconscious body and carried both of them to the service elevator. From here on, the rules of the game changed. The medical team arrived exactly 90 seconds after the helicopter touched down 4 people in tactical black with cases of equipment that looked more military than civilian. Dr. Sarah Chen, Vaughn's personal physician, took one look at Delaney's pale, unresponsive face and snapped orders that sent her team into fluid motion. IV line established in seconds. glucose dripping directly into Delaney's bloodstream. Vitals monitored on portable equipment that probably cost more than most emergency rooms. Vaughn watched it all with the same intensity he brought to hostile negotiations, cataloging every movement, every measurement, every flicker of the doctor's expression. Piper lifted her head just enough to whisper, "Is Mommy going to wake up?" And Vaughn felt something in his chest constrict that had no business existing in a man who'd ordered executions before breakfast. "Yes," he said. And it wasn't a hope or a prayer, it was a command to the universe itself. The helicopter lifted off 12 minutes after it had landed, ferrying Delaney and the medical team to Vaughn's private estate 40 miles north of the city, where a fully equipped medical wing waited with everything short of an operating theater. Vaughn followed in one of the SUVs, Piper still pressed against his side, Marcus driving with the kind of focused silence that meant he had questions but knew better than to ask them. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. By the time they arrived at the estate, a sprawling compound of stone and glass hidden behind walls that could withstand a siege, Delaney had already been moved to a private recovery room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital. Vaughn stood in the doorway and watched Dr. Chen adjust the IV drip, watched the color slowly return to Delaney's face, watched the monitor display numbers that meant her body was clawing its way back from the edge. "She'll wake up within the hour, Doctor," Chen said without looking at him. "Blood sugar is stabilizing. No neurological damage. She's incredibly lucky you acted when you did." Vaughn didn't believe in luck. He believed in decisive action and overwhelming force. "Keep her monitored. I want updates every 15 minutes. Doctor." Chen finally turned to look at him, her expression carefully neutral. "Vaughn, this woman needs consistent medical care, insulin management, regular meals, monitoring equipment. This isn't something you fix with one emergency intervention." "I know," Vaughn said. "Handle it." Delaney woke up to the smell of clean linen and something that might have been jasmine, which made no sense because the last thing she remembered was the harsh chemical scent of floor polish and the sensation of falling. Her eyes opened to soft light filtering through gauze curtains, to walls painted in warm cream, to medical equipment that was too sleek and quiet to belong to any public hospital she'd ever seen. Panic hit like ice water. She tried to sit up and immediately felt the pull of an IV line in her arm, the restrictive tuck of expensive sheets around her body, the wrongness of not knowing where she was or how she'd gotten here. "Mommy," Piper's voice cut through the panic like a lifeline. Delaney turned her head and saw her daughter curled up in an oversized armchair next to the bed, a blanket draped over her small body, her eyes red-rimmed but bright with relief. Piper scrambled out of the chair and climbed onto the bed with the desperate efficiency of a child who'd been terrified and was now clinging to proof that everything was okay. Delaney wrapped her arms around Piper and held on, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind racing to piece together fragments of memory, the lobby, the floor buffer, the sensation of her body failing, and then, oh God, Von Thorne watching her fall. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. "Where are we?" Delaney whispered against Piper's hair. "Mr. Thorne's house," Piper said, her voice muffled against Delaney's shoulder. "He brought us in a helicopter. It was really loud. And there were doctors and they said you were going to be okay, and Mr. Thorne said he'd make sure and he didn't leave until you started looking better and—" "Piper," Delaney interrupted gently, trying to process the flood of words and failing. "Who's Mr. Thorne?" "Me," a voice said from the doorway. Delaney's head snapped up and there he was. Von Thorne, still in the same dark suit from the lobby but with his jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up, looking somehow larger and more dangerous in the soft light of the recovery room than he had under the harsh fluorescence of his tower. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a soft click that felt like a lock engaging. "How are you feeling?" Vaughn asked. And there was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't polite concern. It was a demand for accurate data. "Confused," Delaney managed. Her throat was dry, her thoughts still sluggish. "Terrified." You brought me to your house?" "My estate," Vaughn corrected. "You collapsed from hypoglycemic shock in my building. You're now under the care of my personal medical team. Your daughter has been fed, given clean clothes, and allowed to sleep in a secure environment. You're welcome." The casual arrogance of it, the assumption that she should be grateful for this complete violation of her autonomy, should have made Delaney angry. But she looked at Piper, who was clean and rested and safe in a way Delaney hadn't been able to provide in months, and the anger died before it could fully form. If you've ever had to choose between survival and dignity, if you've ever hidden who you really are just to keep food on the table, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's stand together for everyone who's been forced to choose between living and being seen. I need to leave. Delaney said instead. I have work tomorrow. I can't afford to miss my shift or I'll— You don't have a shift, Vaughn interrupted. I terminated your employment with the cleaning agency an hour ago. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. The words hit like a physical blow. Delaney felt her chest constrict, felt the familiar panic of financial disaster rising up to swallow her whole. You what? You can't just— I need that job. I need the money. I have rent and medications and— You need medical supervision, Vaughn said, his voice cutting through her rising panic with surgical precision. You need consistent meals. You need a stable environment. What you do not need is to work yourself to death cleaning floors while hiding your daughter in maintenance closets. So no, you will not be returning to that job. Delaney stared at him, her mind racing through calculations that all led to the same catastrophic conclusion. She was ruined. Without the job, she couldn't pay rent. Without rent, she and Piper would be on the street. Without an address, she'd lose custody. Without Piper, she had nothing left to fight for. Please, Delaney whispered, and hated the sound of her own desperation. Please, I'll do anything. I'll work harder. I'll take extra shifts. Just please don't take my job. It's all I have. Vaughn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled a chair over to the side of the bed and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. I'm not taking your job, he said. I'm offering you a better one. There was one detail everyone missed. Delaney didn't trust it. Couldn't trust it. Men like Von Thorne didn't offer help, they offered chains disguised as salvation. But Piper was pressed against her side, warm and safe and fed, and Delaney had learned a long time ago that you didn't turn down a lifeline just because you didn't like the person holding the rope. What kind of job? She asked carefully. Vaughn leaned back in the chair, his fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture that probably looked casual to anyone who didn't notice the coiled tension in his shoulders. Before you were a cleaner, you were a logistics analyst. Systems optimization, supply chain management, data modeling. You worked for Mercer Industrial until they downsized 3 years ago. Delaney's blood went cold. How do you know that? Because I had you investigated while you were unconscious, Vaughn said with the kind of blunt honesty that was somehow more terrifying than a lie. I know you have a degree from Northeastern. I know you were on track for a senior analyst position before the company collapsed. I know you've been applying for jobs in your field for 2 years and getting nowhere because the gap in your employment history makes you look unreliable. I know you're brilliant and desperate and completely wasted on floor maintenance. The casual invasion of her privacy should have made Delaney furious. Instead, she just felt exhausted. What do you want? I want you to work for me, Vaughn said. My organization has logistics operations across 11 states. Import, export, distribution, warehousing, legal and otherwise. The systems are functional but inefficient, and I have reason to believe there are structural weaknesses that my competitors are exploiting. I need someone who can see the problems I can't, and fix them before they become catastrophic. Delaney's analytical mind was already working despite her exhaustion, already seeing the shape of what he was offering. You want me to audit your entire operation. I want you to tear it apart and rebuild it, Vaughn corrected. I want you to find every crack, every vulnerability, every place where I'm losing money or leverage or control. And then I want you to show me how to fix it. And in exchange? Delaney asked, though she already knew the answer had to be too good to be true. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. In exchange, you and Piper live here. Full medical coverage, insulin, monitoring equipment, regular physician visits, whatever you need, private security, private education for Piper. A salary that will let you rebuild your savings and actually plan for a future instead of just surviving day to day. You work for me, and I guarantee that neither of you will ever have to hide in a maintenance closet again. It was too much, too generous, too perfect. What's the catch? Delaney demanded. There's always a catch. The catch, Vaughn said, leaning forward, is that once you start seeing how my organization actually works, you can't unsee it. The catch is that you'll be exposed to things that normal people don't witness and survive. The catch is that my enemies will eventually figure out that you're valuable to me, and they'll try to use that against both of us. The catch is that you're trading one kind of danger for another, and this one comes with significantly higher stakes. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Delaney looked down at Piper, who had fallen asleep against her side, exhausted from fear and relief and the kind of emotional whiplash that no 6-year-old should have to experience. She thought about the apartment with its broken heater and the landlord who looked at her like she was a problem he was waiting to evict. She thought about splitting granola bars and rationing insulin and the constant, grinding terror of knowing that one more crisis would destroy everything. And she thought about Von Thorn roaring, "Get the copter," like he could bend reality through sheer force of will. Like saving her life was a command he issued to the universe itself. "I want it in writing," Delaney said. "Every detail. Medical coverage, security, salary, termination clauses. If I'm selling my soul, I want a contract." Something that might have been respect flickered across Von's face. "You'll have it by morning. My lawyers are already drafting it." "And if I find something in your operation that's illegal?" Delaney asked. "If I see something that I morally object to, do I have the option to walk away?" Von's expression went very still. "No," he said. "Once you're in, you're in. That's the price of safety. But I will promise you this. I will never ask you to do something that puts Piper at risk. And I will never let anyone hurt either of you, as long as I'm breathing. That's not in the contract. That's my word." Delaney had no reason to trust his word. But she looked at Piper, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Looked at the medical equipment that was keeping her stable and healthy. Looked at Von Thorn's cold steel eyes, and saw something she recognized. Absolute certainty. He would do exactly what he promised. The question was whether she could live with the cost. "Okay," Delaney whispered. "I'll do it." The estate had 17 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel, and a kitchen that made Delaney's apartment seem like a storage closet by comparison. Vaughn gave her and Piper an entire wing, 3 connected rooms with a bedroom for each of them and a sitting area in between, and told her to make a list of anything they needed. Delaney spent the first 2 days in a haze of medical monitoring and disbelief, watching Piper explore their new space with the kind of cautious joy that broke Delaney's heart. On the 3rd day, Vaughn brought her to his office. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. It was exactly what she expected. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, enough technology to run a small country, and the kind of organized minimalism that spoke of absolute control. He gestured to a desk that had been set up opposite his own, already equipped with 3 monitors, a laptop, and access credentials to systems that probably shouldn't exist. "Everything you need is here," Vaughn said. "Financial records, shipping manifests, supplier contracts, warehouse inventories, distribution routes. If you need access to something that's not in the system, tell me and I'll get it." Delaney sat down and felt something inside her shift into place, the part of her brain that had been dormant for 3 years suddenly waking up, stretching, remembering what it was like to solve problems that actually mattered. She opened the first file and immediately saw the problem. "Your Norfolk distribution center is running at 40% efficiency," she said. "Who's managing it?" Vaughn looked up from his own screen, his expression sharpening. "Vincent Calabrese. He's been with me for 8 years. Why?" "Because either he's incompetent or he's skimming," Delaney said, already pulling up secondary data streams. "Your inventory logs don't match your shipping records. Someone is moving product that's not being documented. It's costing you approximately $2 million a quarter." For the first time, he wasn't in control. Vaughn went very still. "Show me." Delaney spent the next 3 hours walking him through the data, showing him the patterns she could see as clearly as if they were highlighted in neon. Shipping delays that created gaps in the paper trail. Inventory adjustments that were too consistent to be random error. Routes that made no logistical sense unless someone was making unauthorized stops. By the time she finished, Vaughn was standing behind her desk, his hands braced on either side of her chair, his presence looming over her shoulder as he stared at the evidence she'd compiled. "How long would it have taken your previous analysts to find this?" he asked. "If they found it at all? 6 months. Maybe a year." Vaughn was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted exactly 15 seconds. "Norfolk Distribution Center is shut down effective immediately. Calabrese is on a plane to have a conversation with me. And you..." He turned to look at Delaney with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You just saved me $8 million. What else can you find?" Delaney felt something fierce and unfamiliar rise up in her chest. Not just competence, but power. The power to see what others missed. The power to fix what was broken. The power to be valuable in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. "Give me another week," she said. "I'll show you everything." By the end of the first week, Delaney had identified 7 major inefficiencies and 3 serious security vulnerabilities. By the end of the second week, she'd created a comprehensive map of Vaughn's entire logistics network and highlighted every place where his organization was bleeding money or leverage or control. But it was the 3rd week when she found the real problem. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. "You have a rival operation," Delaney said, standing in front of the massive display screen in Vaughn's office, with a dozen data visualizations projected behind her. They're called the Sullivans. And they're not just competing with you, they're systematically undermining your supply chain. Look at this. She pulled up a map showing distribution routes across the Northeast. Every time you lose a shipment, every time you have a delay, every time a warehouse gets raided by federal agents, it's concentrated in these 3 corridors. And all 3 corridors connect to Sullivan-controlled territory. Vaughn studied the screen, his expression carved from stone. You're saying they have people inside my organization. I'm saying they have access to your logistics data, Delaney corrected. Which means either they have people inside your organization, or they're hacking your systems, or someone is selling them information. Either way, they know your routes, your schedules, your vulnerabilities. They're 3 steps ahead of you because they can see everything you're doing before you do it. Vaughn's jaw tightened. How do we stop them? Delaney pulled up another screen, this one showing a network analysis she'd been building for days. We feed them false information. We create phantom routes that look valuable but lead nowhere. We set up controlled failures that make them think they're winning, while we rebuild the real supply chain through corridors they don't know exist. And then, she hesitated, because this next part crossed a line from analysis into strategy, from observer into participant. And then, Vaughn prompted, and then we cut them off completely, Delaney said. We identify their actual revenue streams, the legitimate businesses they use as fronts, and we systematically destroy their ability to move product, legal or otherwise. We don't just beat them, we dismantle them. Vaughn stared at her for a long moment, and Delaney couldn't tell if he was impressed or disturbed. You understand what you're suggesting, he said. You're not just analyzing my operation, you're weaponizing it. Yes, Delaney said. That's what you hired me to do, isn't it? Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, something that looked almost like satisfaction. Yes, he agreed. It is. Show me how. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. The attack came on a Tuesday. Delaney was in the office, 3 weeks into her comprehensive audit of Vaughn's operation, when Marcus appeared in the doorway with an expression that made her stomach drop. We have a situation, Marcus said. Conference room. Now, Delaney followed him down the hall, her heart hammering, and found Vaughn standing at the head of a long table surrounded by 6 men she'd never seen before. All of them looked dangerous. All of them were staring at her. This is a closed meeting, one of them said, a man with silver hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Who the hell is she? She's my analyst, Vaughn said, his voice dropping to that tone that made people instinctively back down. She stays. Your analyst? Silverhair looked at Delaney with open contempt. Vaughn, this is Sullivan Family Intelligence. This isn't something you share with the cleaning crew. Delaney felt the insult land, but kept her expression neutral. She dealt with men like this before, men who assumed that because she was quiet and female and used to be poor, she must be stupid. Vaughn's response was not neutral. He moved so fast that Delaney barely saw it. One moment he was standing at the head of the table. The next he had silver hair pinned against the wall with one hand wrapped around his throat. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. Say that again, Vaughn suggested. His voice was soft, conversational. Absolutely terrifying. I dare you to disrespect her again and see what happens. Silverhair's face was turning red, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Vaughn's wrist. And the other men in the room were frozen, clearly wanting to intervene but not stupid enough to try. Vaughn, Marcus said quietly. He's not worth it. Vaughn held the position for another 3 seconds, long enough to make his point, and then released the man, who slumped against the wall, gasping for air. Vaughn turned back to the table as if nothing had happened. Delaney is my strategic analyst, and she has more intelligence on the Sullivan operation than anyone in this room. If you have a problem with her presence, you can leave. Otherwise, sit down and listen. The men sat down. Delaney stood at Vaughn's right hand and tried not to shake. She'd just watched him commit assault in front of witnesses without a moment's hesitation, and the terrifying thing was that she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what it meant that he'd done it to defend her. That night, after Piper was asleep and the estate had gone quiet except for the low hum of security systems, Delaney found Vaughn standing on the balcony off his office, staring out at the dark expanse of the grounds. She'd come to discuss the logistics analysis she'd finished that afternoon, but the words died in her throat when she saw his expression, something distant and haunted that she'd never seen before. You didn't have to do that, Delaney said quietly. In the meeting, I can handle people being dismissive. Vaughn didn't turn around. I know you can. That's not why I did it. Then why? Are you Team Delaney and Vaughn? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. This story is just getting started. Because the moment I allowed him to disrespect you, it would have spread, Vaughn said. By tomorrow, every associate in my organization would have heard that you could be insulted without consequence. And someone would have decided to test exactly how far they could push before I reacted. This way, there's no question. Delaney moved to stand beside him at the railing, close enough to feel the cold night air but not close enough to touch. Is that what I am? She asked. A territory you're defending? Vaughn finally turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. No, he said. You're something much more dangerous than that. What? Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. You're someone I need, Vaughn said. I've built an empire on the principle that needing anyone is a weakness that gets you killed. And then you showed up with your data models and your analytical brilliance and your goddamn stubborn refusal to be intimidated, and suddenly I need you to see things I can't see. I need your analysis to protect my operation. I need your presence to make this house feel like something other than a fortress. And I need... He stopped, his jaw working. I need you to understand that I will destroy anyone who threatens you. Not because you're my employee or my analyst or my responsibility. Because you're mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her. Instead, Delaney felt something hot and fierce unfurl in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed. I'm not yours, she said. I'm not anyone's. Then what are you? Vaughn challenged. Delaney looked at him, this dangerous, powerful man who'd saved her life and given her daughter safety and trusted her with his empire, and told him the truth. I'm someone who's done hiding, she said. I'm someone who's done being invisible, and I'm someone who's going to take everything you're offering and turn it into something neither of us expected. So if you're going to keep me Vaughn Thorne, you'd better be ready for what that actually means. Vaughn stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled a real smile. Not the controlled expression he showed the world, but something genuine and slightly dangerous. I'm ready, he said. For once he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Friday when Delaney couldn't sleep and decided to run one more analysis on the Sullivan family's financial networks. She'd been mapping their cash flow for 2 weeks, following the money through shell corporations and offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their illegal operations. But there was something she kept missing, some pattern that her exhausted brain couldn't quite grasp. She made coffee. She pulled up the data. She stared at the screens until her eyes burned. And then she saw it. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. Oh my God, Delaney whispered to the empty office. Oh my God, you idiots. The Sullivans had been brilliant in their diversification. They had their illegal operations, drug distribution, money laundering, smuggling carefully separated from their legitimate businesses. But they'd made one critical mistake. They were using the same logistics software for everything, the same routing algorithms, the same optimization models, which meant that if someone knew what to look for, they could map the illegal operations by finding the ghost patterns in the legitimate ones. Delaney worked through the night, building a model that showed exactly how the Sullivan Empire functioned, not just the criminal side, but the entire interconnected web of businesses and routes and cash flows. By the time the sun came up, she had something that no law enforcement agency had ever managed to compile. A complete blueprint of how to dismantle the Sullivan organization from the inside out. She printed the analysis, all 47 pages of it, and walked upstairs to where Vaughn was already awake, standing in his private gym going through a training routine that looked more like preparation for war than exercise. I found it, Delaney said. Vaughn stopped mid-movement and turned to face her, sweat sheening his skin, his expression sharpening instantly. Found what? Delaney held up the printed report. Everything. How they move product, where they hide cash, which businesses are fronts and which are legitimate, who's on their payroll, where they're vulnerable, how to destroy them. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. Vaughn took the report from her hands and began reading, his eyes moving quickly over the pages, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When he reached the final page, the one where Delaney had outlined the strategic plan to systematically cripple the Sullivan operation, he looked up at her with something that might have been awe. This is extraordinary, Vaughn said. This is Delaney. Do you understand what you've just given me? Power, Delaney said. The power to end a war before it starts. The power to protect yourself and your people. The power to make sure that the Sullivans can never threaten us again. Us, she'd said us, not you, us. Vaughn set the report down on a bench and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. His hands came up to frame her face, and Delaney's breath caught because she knew what was about to happen, and she wanted it with a ferocity that should have terrified her. "You brilliant, terrifying woman," Vaughn said. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Tell me," Delaney whispered. "You've made me believe in something I thought was impossible," Vaughn said, and then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was claim and promise and acknowledgement all wrapped together, the kiss of a man who'd finally stopped fighting what he wanted and decided to take it with both hands. Delaney kissed him back with 3 years of anger and desperation and loneliness pouring out in a rush, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressed against his like she could merge them into a single, unbreakable unit. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers and said the words that changed everything. "I love you," he said, "and I'm going to keep you forever. Do you understand? I'm going to keep you and Piper in this brilliant mind of yours, and I'm never letting go." Delaney should have said something careful, something measured, something that acknowledged the insanity of falling in love with a man like Von Thorne. Instead, she told him the truth. "Good," she said, "because I'm not going anywhere." The execution of Delaney's plan took 4 weeks and involved coordination across 11 states, 3 federal agencies who didn't know they were being manipulated, and a level of strategic precision that made Vaughn's previous operations look like amateur hour. He had no idea the night would end in blood. They started with the legitimate businesses filing anonymous tips that triggered audits and investigations that exposed enough irregularities to shut down the Sullivans' fronts, without revealing the larger criminal enterprise. Then they moved to the supply chain, systematically cutting off the Sullivans' access to their distribution networks by making better offers to their suppliers. Or when that didn't work, making it very clear that working with the Sullivans was a career-ending decision. Finally, they targeted the money itself, freezing offshore accounts through carefully orchestrated legal challenges, seizing assets through civil forfeiture laws, and making it impossible for the Sullivan operation to pay their people or move their cash. What followed next was completely unexpected. It was bloodless. It was legal. It was absolutely devastating. By the end of the 4th week, the Sullivan family's empire was in ruins. Their businesses shuttered, their supply chain destroyed, their cash flow dried up, their people jumping ship to work for Vaughn's organization instead. Marcus delivered the final report on a Saturday morning. "It's done," he said. "The Sullivans just declared bankruptcy." Shane Sullivan himself called, asking for a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. Vaughn looked at Delaney, who was sitting at her desk reviewing the final logistics projections, and felt something settle in his chest that he'd never experienced before. Absolute certainty that he'd found the one person in the world who could stand beside him and make him stronger rather than vulnerable. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. "Tell Shane Sullivan," Vaughn said, "that I accept his surrender, and that he has exactly 24 hours to leave the state before I change my mind." The proposal happened on a Tuesday, which was fitting because Delaney had always thought that the best decisions were made on ordinary days rather than special occasions. They were in the office, Delaney running projections for next quarter's logistics expansion, Vaughn reviewing contracts for a new acquisition when he suddenly closed his laptop and said, "Marry me." Delaney looked up, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. "What?" "Marry me," Vaughn repeated. "Not because it's logical or strategic, or because it protects you legally, though those things are all true. Marry me because I have never met anyone like you, because you see the world in patterns that no one else can see. Because you took my organization apart and rebuilt it into something stronger than I ever could have achieved alone. Because Piper calls me Dad now, and I would die for that child without hesitation. Because I love you so completely that the thought of you leaving makes me want to burn the world down. Marry me, Delaney Shaw, and let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to hide again." He didn't want revenge, he needed it. Delaney sat there, her mind racing through calculations and projections and logical arguments, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, the answer didn't require analysis. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. Because you saved my life when you had no reason to. Because you gave Piper safety when I couldn't. Because you trusted me with your empire when I was nobody. And because I love you too, you terrifying, impossible man. Yes." Vaughn was around the desk before she finished speaking, pulling her up and kissing her with enough force to make her forget that they were in an office, that it was Tuesday, that anything existed beyond this moment. When they finally broke apart, he slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple platinum band with a single diamond that caught the light like captured starlight. "This was my grandmother's," Vaughn said. She was the only person in my family who believed that power should be shared rather than hoarded. I think she would have liked you." Delaney looked at the ring, then at Vaughn, then at the office where she'd spent the last 2 months rebuilding an empire from the inside out. "What do I call myself now?" she asked. "Your wife? Your analyst? Your partner?" "Call yourself whatever you want," Vaughn said. "But to me, you'll always be the woman who changed everything." 6 months later, Delaney Shaw, now Delaney Thorne, stood in the office on the 47th floor of Thorne Tower and looked out at the city that had once felt like a prison and now felt like a kingdom. The office was hers now, not because Vaughn had given it to her, but because she'd earned it, redesigning his logistics operation so efficiently that they'd increased profit margins by 34%, expanded into 6 new territories, and become the dominant force in every market they touched. She wore a suit that cost more than 3 months of her old salary. Her hair was styled by a private stylist. Her insulin pump was the latest medical technology, monitored remotely by Dr. Chen's team. She had a personal security detail that followed her everywhere, not because she was Vaughn's wife, but because she was valuable enough in her own right to be a target. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. But the best part, the part that made everything else worth it, was watching Piper through the glass wall that separated her office from the small conference room where her daughter was doing homework with a private tutor. Piper looked healthy, happy, safe. She called Vaughn Dad without hesitation. She went to a private school where no one looked at her like she was too poor to matter. She had friends and extracurriculars, and a future that stretched out before her like an open road. "Admiring your empire?" Vaughn's voice came from behind her, and Delaney turned to find her husband leaning against the doorframe, looking at her with an expression that still made her breath catch. "Our empire," Delaney corrected. "I just run the logistics. You run everything else." "You revolutionized the logistics?" Vaughn corrected. "There's a difference." He crossed the office and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both looked out at the city. "Do you ever regret it?" Vaughn asked quietly. "Saying yes? Trading your freedom for safety?" He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. Delaney thought about the woman she used to be, exhausted, desperate, hiding her daughter in maintenance closets and rationing insulin, and believing that survival was the best she could hope for. And she thought about the woman she'd become, powerful, valued, loved in a way that felt like coming home. "I didn't trade freedom for safety," Delaney said. "I traded hiding for being seen. And that's not a loss. That's everything I ever wanted." Vaughn pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Mrs. Thorne." "I love you too," Delaney said. And she meant it. She meant it with every fiber of her being, this brilliant, impossible love that had started with a child's desperate plea and a man's roared command and had grown into something unbreakable. She was Delaney Thorne now. She was the logistics queen. She was the woman who'd been invisible and became essential. She was the mother who'd hidden her daughter and now gave her the world. She was the analyst who saw patterns no one else could see. And she was loved fiercely, completely, permanently, by the most dangerous man in the city. And that, Delaney thought as she watched Piper laugh at something her tutor said, as she felt Vaughn's arms solid and steady around her, as she looked out at the empire they'd built together that was worth everything. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Your support keeps these stories alive.